The second round of peace talks between Ukraine and Russia in Istanbul is approaching. Expectations are low. However, the Russian side continues to delay, failing to provide its own memorandum despite earlier promises to do so after a planned prisoner exchange of 1,000 for 1,000. Meanwhile, behind the Kremlin's game of negotiations, Russia is preparing for a summer offensive. At the same time, Ukraine is striking deeper into Russian territory, expanding cooperation with European partners and maybe entering a new phase in its relationship with the United States. One thing is certain, Ukraine has no intention of surrendering. Joining me now in the studio is Paul Lewandowski, U.S. Army veteran. I've been looking forward to this conversation for a long time. His YouTube channel has often provided answers to military, political and tactical questions for me personally and for hundreds of thousands of viewers around the world. Welcome, Paul.
Thanks for having me.
So, Paul, let's begin from the latest news. Ukraine just struck Vladivostok, the farthest Russian target hit so far for us. Reports say the operation damaged troops, equipment and specialized systems of the 155th Naval Infantry Brigade. Do you expect more such strikes inside Russia, even far from the front line?
I would. And I think in part, we've heard some EU partners explicitly say in the last week that they are looking at and may have authorized Ukraine to expand the areas where they can deploy EU-provided weapons. I think there's also a increasing sense among European partners that say, hey, a lot of the previous red lines that we sort of self-imposed on our aid and our weapon systems have not been respected, right? They haven't gotten Putin to de-escalate the war. Putin has essentially escalated at the time and place that he's wanted to. And so I think a lot of EU partners are saying, okay, well, we tied our own hands and we tied Ukraine's hands, and it never really achieved what we had hoped, which was a sort of containment of Putin's aims in the war. And so I think you're going to definitely see Ukraine sort of reach further and deeper into Russia. I think that also reflects a strategic choice by Ukraine to target deeper into Russian logistics. And again, I think Vladivostok is in part symbolic, showing that there is nowhere Ukraine can't reach, which has value in and of itself. But I also think it's noteworthy that just a point to pay attention to is that when North Korean munitions and troops transit, according to at least some of the leaked information, these troops are moving, again, over land borders and would almost certainly use Vladivostok and military facilities there as some kind of transit hub. And so I wouldn't be shocked if we subsequently learn that this operation targeted the ability of Russia to move those North Korean troops and munitions in, or at least towards the front line.
Yeah, Paul, right. I wish we could do so 3 years ago. And
yeah, Oh, go ahead.
No. Keep going.
Yeah, and that's, I think, been one of the larger issues that kind of the West in general, I think the EU, even the US to an extent under the Biden administration had, was that they self-constrained a lot of their aid. They said, okay, Ukraine can't operate in certain locations. They can't deploy aid in certain places. And that the idea was that would sort of, one, contain Putin, and that it would give the West additional cards to play in the event Putin expanded the war. But I think with someone like Vladimir Putin, it ended up looking more like giving Putin permission to lead the dance, so to speak. Escalations happened. They just happened on his own timeline. And so I think the waiting this long is a miscalculation by Western countries in general and a misunderstanding of Putin's willingness to pursue ever more aggressive policies in Ukraine.
Yeah, and my next question is about the main newsmaker probably in the world right now, Donald Trump. In the US, it seems like people understand what Putin's war is really about. Senator Lindsey Graham visited Istanbul recently, pushing for substantial sanctions, but no one dares to confront Donald Trump directly. Why do you think that is? At least we have that impression here in Ukraine.
Yeah, so the second Trump administration is very different from the first. In the first, he structured his administration a lot like other administrations, where there were advisors who provided him key information and were empowered to make certain key decisions. In this one, he seems to have adopted what the Japanese called a monarchy's court system, where individual friends and family, formal and informal, sort of had the king's ear, and he has a much more personal control over U.S. policy. And so I think the fact that it's possible people have confronted him over this, away from cameras, but they probably were basically kicked out of the administration because, like anyone else who would go to a medieval king and criticize their policies, it doesn't end well for them. And so obviously, when you're the most powerful democracy in the world, that's not really a way you can run any modern government, let alone the United States. But I think fundamentally the fact that reality can't seem to get through to him is because essentially he's surrounded by yes men. He
as
like
Putin,
any
actually.
other medieval king.
Yes, Paul, as Putin, he also surrounded by people who's saying, yes, we're advancing on the front line and stuff like that.
Yeah, it's one of the more disturbing trends is how closely the structure of the Russian government and the Kremlin mirrors the Trump administration, where it's a cult of personality with a central leader at the core. There is both the formal advisors around him, people like Gerasimov or Lavrov, but then you also have this informal cadre who is equally or possibly even more powerful in the form of Russia's business oligarchs and other individuals who are equally influential but don't hold formal positions within the Russian government. And the fact that they work on kind of a curry favor, they are compensated through sort of corruption schemes and looting the state. All of these trends are really troubling parallels, at least to me.
We have air raid sirens, so probably I hope it's not going to interrupt our interview right now. Former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo probably just this morning said and admitted that the U.S. didn't do enough to stop the war back in 2014 and again in 2022. Now he says the mission is, the main mission right now is to restore stability. Paul, is that even possible, given who's currently in the White House, to restore stability?
The disposition of Trump is not a stable one. I don't think that's controversial. You can scroll through his Twitter feed and you can see someone who doesn't seem to hold stable opinions or stable stances. So the goal of restoring stability is probably going to be pretty difficult. I think the fundamental miscalculation from 2014 that former Secretary of State Pompeo's acknowledging is something that almost every U.S. administration has seen with Vladimir Putin since about really the Bush administration. Bush took office and he adopted this perspective that I think sometimes a lot of the West has, which is, Vladimir Putin is probably a good guy who's just misunderstood. He just has a different perspective. And if we could just get together and have a nice chat, we could sort out our differences. And literally Bush tried to do that, brought Putin to his ranch. They did a bunch of dove hunting. And he's really thought that he could understand Putin. And in exchange for his naivete, Putin invaded Georgia. And then Obama came in and said the exact same thing. Oh, Bush was so combative with Putin. He didn't understand him. We're going to have a reset. And in exchange for that a reset, Putin took it as permission to annex Crimea and the Donbass. And so the only person who didn't seem to give Putin this like friendly reset when he took office was President Biden. And again, I think he wasn't nearly as willing as he should have been to punish Putin for these actions. But at least he bucked the trend of U.S. presidents giving Putin a clean slate every 4 years. And so in a way, it was almost predictable that Trump would come in and say, oh, no, Putin's just misunderstood. We just need to get to understand each other. But again, I think that's a fundamentally naive view. Vladimir Putin lives in a world of realpolitik. He lives in a world of power politics. You know, he doesn't think the global environment of today. He said this. He's like, it's no different than 1000 AD in Moscow, right? A king with an army who marches and conquers, and that's how you grow your empire. And the West needs to finally understand that that is the view of the person they're sitting across from. There's not understanding, shaking hands, hunting dove together. These things aren't going to change a fundamentally medieval view of the world.
Yeah, I hope for that. Speaking about Trump's naiveness, Donald Trump claimed to be a master negotiator, and yet he's failed to deliver any meaningful results on Ukraine. In fact, he's contradicted everything he once wrote about deals. How do you explain this complete failure in his leadership?
I think it's primarily he is exactly the person he has been consistently. His real estate portfolio has been kind of a disaster. He's been bankrupted multiple times, and his most successful financial venture was in reality television, where performance is the only thing that matters, right? The actual delivery of concrete results. In some ways, would be bad if a reality show had a concrete resolution, right? You always need another episode, another season. And so I think master negotiator is just a marketing term that he uses to sell his books and to campaign. The fact is that you look at his chief envoy, Steve Witkoff. To me, this is emblematic of sort of the Trump negotiation playbook. Steve Witkoff had served 0 days in any kind of government role, prior to the Trump administration. So he is, as of today, I think 110 days of serving in government. And he was tasked with sitting opposite not only Vladimir Putin, Sergei Lavrov. These are guys with decades of experience at the very top of international diplomacy. And Steve Witkoff had 200 days ago, Steve Witkoff was doing real estate deals, buying condos in South Florida. So the fact that the president was unable to distinguish between meaningful experience in a field and meaningless experience is really troubling. And again, we see that in the fact that Steve Witkoff didn't appear to be able to name the contested regions, right? He couldn't even identify where was being fought over. He believed that the Russian referendums held in the occupied territories, done at literal gunpoint, were somehow valid referendums. Just unbelievably naivete from, again, Trump's personally selected envoy. And I think you get what you pay for, and I think that reflects the fact that Trump, at his most basic assumptions, he does not understand what it takes or means to actually achieve good international negotiations and to achieve good outcomes.
But still, it's very hard to realize and understand that people are so naive, as you're saying, but still they're becoming presidents or people close to him. That, just can understand that.
Yeah, it's sort of it is a feature of every democracy is that you could be the best at governing a country, but you also have to win an election. And the problem is that they're not quite the same skill set, right? And a good, in most democracies, right, there's a lot of civic education, there's access to good information, and so you hope voters try to vote that way. They vote for someone they think will govern well, but Donald Trump just has a strange and sometimes difficult to understand ability to be really persuasive to the U.S. public, to really convince them that their problems can be solved by him. But in terms of his actual ability to execute governance, especially in this administration, it's unbelievably low. It's an imbalance that's rare even in democracies.
Yeah, but do you believe that Trump is giving Putin a green light for a war of attrition? That deep down, he's simply waiting for Ukraine to surrender, to wave with a white flag?
I think so. It's difficult to know if he knows, because there's so many unforced errors in this administration in general, and especially with Ukraine, where I think Trump is – Trump as a South Florida real estate guy, as a New York real estate guy, there is a level of loyalty, and favors are kind of the currency of those environments. And so I think he believes that Putin assisted him tremendously in winning the election in 2016. I think that was pretty firmly established. And so I think he is unable to confront Putin in any kind of meaningful way, right? He's resorted to seething on Twitter or holding these round after round of negotiations that Putin clearly doesn't want to participate in. But I think in terms of actually harming Putin's ability to conduct the war, Trump is unwilling to do it because he sees Putin as someone who helped him. And when you owe someone a favor in the world of New York or, South Florida real estate, you always make good on your favors. Yeah.
Okay. But I've just heard the opinion that, and I'm curious, would you agree or not, that the war for territorial occupation in Ukraine by Russia ended in 2022, and what we are seeing now is just a long grinding war of exhaustion. Well, do you agree with this, or do you have a different perspectives? And yeah.
Yeah, I think the ultimate goal for Vladimir Putin is to achieve the vassalization of Ukraine, and if possible, sort of a partial vassalization of NATO, right? And the word like vassalization, again, it's a medieval term for when a country is ostensibly independent but is beholden completely to the metropole, right? And so in this case, he wants to essentially turn Ukraine into Belarus, right? Belarus is an independent country, but Lukashenko takes no action without Putin's permission. Economically, Belarus is essentially gutted.
They obey, absolutely. They obey to Russia, of course.
Right, exactly. And I think that is the model he wants to achieve with Ukraine. He wants a government that is fully subservient to Russia. And I think further than that, he also is beginning to more explicitly expand his desire to achieve a veto power over NATO, right? He wants to be able to tell NATO, these are the countries you can admit, these are the countries you can't, because again, veto power is power. As I always say, I have an 18-month-old daughter, and she can do whatever she wants, but dad always gets a veto, right? We don't get to eat chocolate for dinner. And so obviously, I think that's the relationship Putin aspires to have with NATO. NATO can do anything they want, but Putin can sell them no.
And I was reading about the Russian mobilization this summer, 2025. I mean, do you see any signs of that, and what the consequences would be or could be?
I would be extremely surprised to see a full mobilization in 2025, as Putin attempted to do in 2022. I think one of the reasons the Russian public continues to support this war is because the primary individuals being recruited and killed in it are poor, older Russians from sort of remote regions. There's very few upper middle class Russians who are brought into this. They are not the sons and daughters of Russia's elite or even their middle class. And Putin knows this. He knows he needs their loyalty to stay in power, right? Putin's power is not absolute. It depends, again, on the oligarchs and on his sort of political inner circle. And losing the support, or at least the passivity of the larger Russian public, would be a disaster for him. It would also be an economic disaster because, as we saw in 2022, a huge swath of Russia's most productive citizens, right, young men who have completed their military service, fled the country. And in a lot of cases, they still haven't returned. And for Putin, losing another tranche of their most productive workers when there's already a growing labor crisis would be a disaster. So I would be shocked to see a broad mobilization this year.
But at the same time, probably you remember the quote of Medinsky in Istanbul, who was representing Russia, and he said, "We are ready to fight forever, for 20 years, for more than 20 years, as we were fighting with Sweden." I mean, is that just a manipulation?
Yeah, Putin sent to these negotiations someone who didn't have the political power to make any kind of deal with Ukraine. He went there. He was reported to have threatened Ukrainian negotiators personally, their families and loved ones. This is someone who went there to troll. So I wouldn't take any stock in anything he said. And of course, they're going to project that, right? Putin's going to project strength. But the guy they sent, he probably wouldn't even have access to the information about actual Russian recruitment numbers, actual troop numbers. The best sort of proxy, I think, to tell is the bonuses that Russia has to pay these recruits to sign up. And those continue to grow ever higher. And I think that is the real data. No one should really listen to anything the Russian government says, because it's at least anything publicly disclosed is primarily propaganda. It's primarily for, honestly, the Russian public's own consumption.